Big Shaq was just grabbing some snacks when he heard it. If you can't afford it, don't buy it. A rich man sneered at a struggling mother in the checkout line. The store fell silent. Eyes turned. Cameras started rolling. But instead of arguing, Shaq smiled. Because he had a plan. What he did next exposed corruption, changed lives, and left the entire city in shock. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Big Shaq reached for a bag of chips, casually scanning the snack aisle. The grocery store buzzed with the usual evening rush, shopping carts rolling, cash registers beeping, and murmured conversations filling the air. He adjusted his hoodie, keeping a low profile. But then, just as his fingers brushed the shelf, something made him stop mid-reach. At the front of the store, a young mother stood at the checkout, her hands trembling as she counted crumpled dollar bills. The cashier, a teenage boy with a worried expression, glanced between her and the growing line behind her. Jessica, the mother, sighed heavily. She bit her lip, her face flushing with embarrassment as she started putting items back. A gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, even a small box of cereal that one of her kids had been clutching moments ago. Her two little children stood beside her, wide-eyed and confused. The youngest, a boy no older than 5, tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, why are we putting food back?" he asked softly. Jessica forced a smile, but Shaq could see the pain behind it. "We'll get it next time, baby," she whispered. A scoffing noise came from behind her in line. A man in a stiff business suit rolled his eyes, exhaling dramatically. "If you can't afford it," he muttered, loud enough for the entire line to hear, "don't buy it." Jessica froze. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, she just stood there, gripping the edge of the checkout counter. The store fell uncomfortably silent. Danny, the young cashier, shifted uncomfortably. His uniform was a little too big, his name tag barely hanging on. He looked torn, clearly wanting to help, but knowing the store's policy wouldn't allow it. Shaq's jaw tightened. His massive frame straightened as he set his chips down and stepped forward. The moment his deep, steady voice cut through the air, the entire store seemed to pause. "Nah," Shaq said, stepping up beside Jessica. His towering presence made the rude man shrink back instantly. "Nobody's going hungry today." Jessica turned, eyes widening in shock. The cashier's breath hitched, and every single person in that store turned to see what Shaq was about to do next. All eyes locked on Shaq as he stood beside Jessica, his presence impossible to ignore. Jessica turned slowly, her breath hitching as she took in the towering figure beside her. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. There was no way the man standing next to her, who had just silenced an entire grocery store with a single sentence, was who she thought he was. "Wait, are you?" Her voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper, as she tried to process what was happening. Shaq didn't let her finish. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick leather wallet, his fingers moving with certainty as he flipped it open. He glanced at the cashier and spoke in his deep, steady voice. "Add it all back," he said, nodding toward the items Jessica had been forced to return. "I got this." Danny, the young cashier, hesitated, his fingers hovering over the register's touchscreen. He looked at Jessica, then back at Shaq, as if waiting for someone to confirm this wasn't some kind of prank. Jessica's hands trembled as she clutched the few crumpled dollar bills she had left. Her face, already flushed from embarrassment, turned a deeper shade of red. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she shook her head, her pride making it difficult to accept such generosity. "You don't have to," she started, her voice thick with emotion. Shaq gave her a small but firm shake of his head. "Yeah, I do." His tone left no room for argument, but it wasn't demanding. It was reassuring, almost as if he was telling her that accepting help wasn't something to be ashamed of. Behind them, the businessman from earlier let out a loud, annoyed scoff. "Oh, for God's sake," he muttered, adjusting the sleeves of his expensive suit. "This is ridiculous." Jessica flinched slightly, her shoulders tensing at the judgment in the man's voice. She had spent years hearing things like that, feeling like a burden when all she was trying to do was survive. Shaq, however, didn't even acknowledge the man. His focus remained on Danny, who still seemed unsure whether he was even allowed to process this transaction. The young cashier cleared his throat and finally spoke. "Sir, our policy says we can't accept tips over $20. His voice was cautious, almost apologetic, like he was afraid of upsetting a customer, but also didn't want to lose his job. Shaq's eyebrow arched slightly, his lips curling in mild amusement. Tip? He repeated, his voice calm, but carrying just enough weight to make the entire store feel like they were waiting for what he was going to say next. Who said anything about a tip? With that, he reached back into his wallet and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. He didn't hesitate as he placed it on the counter, the weight of it landing with a soft but unmistakable thud. The store fell into stunned silence as every pair of eyes locked onto the fat stack of cash sitting between Shaq and the cashier. Danny's hands hovered uncertainly over the register, his eyes locked on the thick stack of bills Shaq had just placed on the counter. His throat felt dry as he swallowed hard, struggling to process what was happening. Sir, that's way too much, he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica, still stunned, wiped at the tears spilling onto her cheeks. She looked down at the money, then up at Shaq, shaking her head in disbelief. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Shaq gave her a reassuring nod, his expression calm but firm. You don't need to, he said simply. Just take care of your kids. Danny let out a slow breath, still gripping the edge of the counter as if he needed something to keep himself steady. He'd seen people pay in cash before, but never like this. The sheer weight of generosity in front of him felt overwhelming. That's really generous, man, Danny said, glancing up at Shaq with genuine admiration. You don't see this every day. Shaq finally took a moment to really look at Danny. The young cashier had dark circles under his eyes, his uniform slightly faded and worn, as if it had been washed one too many times. His name tag barely clung to his shirt, a corner of it bent from years of use. You've been here a while, Shaq asked, his deep voice quieter now, more thoughtful. Danny nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, almost 3 years, he admitted. I needed a job after my mom got sick. She can't work, so here I am. Shaq studied him for a long moment, taking in the quiet resilience behind Danny's words. The kid wasn't complaining. He wasn't bitter. He was just doing what he had to do, trying to hold everything together. Good man, Shaq said finally, nodding his approval. For the first time in a long while, Danny felt seen, not just as some random cashier at a grocery store, but as someone whose struggle mattered. Just as the tension in the air started to settle, a sharp voice cut through the moment. The store manager suddenly stormed toward them, his expression twisted with anger. Excuse me, what's going on here? A sharp, impatient voice sliced through the moment, making Danny flinch. Shaq turned slowly, his towering frame shifting as he locked eyes with a stiff, middle-aged man in a crisp button-up shirt and a tie that looked like it had been yanked too tight. His name tag read, Mr. Collins, store manager. Collins's expression was a mix of annoyance and authority, his gaze bouncing between the thick stack of cash on the counter and Danny, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. Sir, Collins began, his voice clipped. We have policies against large cash transactions. Shaq smirked, folding his massive arms across his chest. Oh yeah, he drawled. Y'all got a policy against feeding people too? A few customers nearby stifled chuckles, but Collins wasn't amused. His jaw clenched. That's not the point. Store policy states that cash payments above a certain amount require corporate approval. And Danny, he turned sharply toward the young cashier. You are not authorized to process this. Danny swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of the register. I was just trying to... Collins held up a hand, silencing him. Then shifting his attention back to Shaq, he squared his shoulders and exhaled sharply. And you, he continued, lowering his voice but making sure everyone nearby could hear. You can't just throw money around in here like this is your personal charity drive. Shaq's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened slightly. That's so? He mused, tilting his head slightly. Tell me something, Collins. How long you been running this place? Collins stiffened, clearly not expecting the question. That's none of your business. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Nah, see, I just want to understand how a guy like you got put in charge of something as simple as selling food and still managed to mess it up. A murmur spread through the customers who had gathered nearby. Some smirked, others nodded in quiet agreement. Collins's face turned red, his authority slipping with every second. Jessica, still holding her kids close, took a hesitant step forward. Please, she said softly, her voice pleading. It's just groceries. I wasn't asking for help, but he offered. Collins barely spared her a glance. That's not my concern. If you can't afford it, that's not the store's problem. The way he said it, cold, dismissive, absolute, made Shaq's jaw tighten. He turned slightly, glancing at Danny, whose knuckles were white from gripping the counter too hard. The kid wasn't just nervous. He was terrified. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Oh, so that's how you run things here?" he murmured. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous underneath it. Collins crossed his arms, his confidence returning. "That's how this business works." Shaq's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. "Cool. Then let's talk business." Shaq stood his ground, arms crossed over his chest, his massive frame towering over Collins. His voice was steady, calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. "So let me get this straight." Shaq's deep voice carried through the store. "You're mad at a kid for helping someone in need?" Collins let out a scoff, straightening his tie as if that would help him regain control of the situation. "This isn't a charity," he snapped. "It's a business. We have rules, policies." Shaq held up a hand, cutting him off. Yeah, I heard you the first time." He turned slightly, glancing at Danny, who was still frozen behind the register. The kid looked like he was waiting for the hammer to drop, for the moment Collins would tell him to pack up and leave. Shaq exhaled and nodded. "All right," he said smoothly. "Let's talk business then." Before Collins could respond, Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen and brought it to his ear. "Yo," he said casually, "pull up this grocery chain's stock price for me." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jessica, still holding her kids, stared at Shaq in disbelief. Even Danny blinked, confusion flashing across his face. Collins's smirk wavered. "Wait, what?" Shaq's assistant must have answered quickly because a moment later, Shaq nodded. "Yeah, that's what I thought." He looked up, locking eyes with Collins. "Your company," Shaq said, his voice slow and deliberate, "has been losing revenue for 3 straight quarters. Stock's down nearly 20% this year. Rough holiday sales. Not looking too good, huh?" Collins swallowed hard. That's none of your concern." Shaq let out a low chuckle. "Oh, it is now." He turned to Jessica, then to Danny, then back to Collins. "See, you run this store like a man who thinks he's untouchable. Like you don't answer to nobody." Shaq leaned in slightly, voice lowering just enough to make Collins shift uncomfortably. "But I wonder," Shaq continued, "if your boss would feel the same way." Collins' face paled. "Sir, I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Shaq interrupted, flashing a grin. "I just want to see something real quick." Shaq scrolled on his phone and smirked. "Let's see how much your company is worth." Collins's face twisted in disbelief as Shaq's assistant spoke into the phone, her voice crisp and professional. "Sir, I just pulled up the latest financial reports. It's not just this location. The entire grocery chain has been struggling for months. Declining profits, falling stock prices, bad press from labor disputes." She paused for a moment, listening to the response on the other end. "Yes, sir. They've already closed 5 stores this quarter." Collins' breath hitched. His confident posture wavered. The arrogance that had been fueling his smug attitude just seconds ago was crumbling right in front of everyone. Shaq shook his head slowly, clicking his tongue. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Bad management ruins everything." A hushed murmur spread through the customers standing nearby. Jessica, still clutching her grocery bag with one arm and holding her youngest child's hand with the other, blinked in astonishment. "Is this really happening?" she whispered, barely believing what she was witnessing. Danny, the young cashier who had just been scolded minutes earlier, swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the register. His eyes darted between Shaq and Collins. "Wait, are you thinking of—" Shaq turned to face him, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I was looking to buy something today," he said smoothly. "Maybe it's this company." A collective gasp rippled through the store. Employees froze. Customers glanced at each other, their expressions a mix of shock and excitement. Even the rude customer who had insulted Jessica earlier suddenly looked like he wanted to shrink into the background. Collins, who had been trying to keep his composure, finally lost it. His hands trembled as he straightened his tie and forced a tight, nervous laugh. "Sir, please," he stammered, the smugness completely gone from his voice. Let's talk privately." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his towering presence making Collins look even smaller. "Why?" he asked, tilting his head. "Slightly. Something you don't want people to hear?" Collins's face drained of all color. He glanced around, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, please," he whispered again, desperation creeping into his tone. The shrill ring of a corporate office phone echoed through the marble-floored headquarters of Greenmark Grocery. Behind an oversized mahogany desk, CEO Richard Reynolds absent-mindedly scrolled through financial reports on his tablet, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He had been dreading this quarter's numbers, but nothing prepared him for the frantic voice that erupted from the speaker as he picked up. "Sir, we might have a situation," the panicked voice of Collins stammered. Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "What now? There's a man here, a very important man, and he's threatening to buy the company." Reynolds sat up straighter. "What?" His grip tightened on the phone. Collins' voice trembled. "It's Shaquille O'Neal." Reynolds' blood ran cold. He swiped open his laptop and clicked onto the trending newsfeed. His heart nearly stopped. A live stream from one of the store's customers was already going viral. Millions of views and climbing. The screen showed Big Shaq standing near the register, arms crossed, looking as casual as ever, while Collins practically melted in front of him. Customers whispered in the background, and the comments flooded in. "Shaq is about to own that store. Y'all messed with the wrong guy." "No way, or is he actually buying the company?" Reynolds' mouth went dry. The last thing Greenmart needed was another PR disaster. And this was about to explode. He didn't need to read the comments to know that the board would be on his neck by morning. He slammed his hand on the intercom. "Get the car ready, now." "But sir, your next meeting," his assistant started. "Cancel everything," Reynolds barked, already grabbing his coat. "If I don't handle this personally, we'll lose everything before the stock market even opens." Tires screeched as a sleek black SUV peeled out of the underground parking garage, its destination locked in. Reynolds tightened his seatbelt, gripping his phone. He had one chance to salvage this disaster before Shaq turned his grocery chain into his business empire. The automatic glass doors whooshed open, and the entire grocery store seemed to freeze. The air grew thick with tension as a tall, sharply dressed man strode inside, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tile floor. His tailored navy blue suit screamed authority, but the tightness in his jaw and the thin sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed something else: panic. Collins, the store manager, nearly tripped over himself as he rushed forward. "Mr. Reynolds, sir, Richard Reynolds, the CEO of Greenmart Grocery, barely acknowledged him. His sharp blue eyes scanned the store, taking in the silent crowd, the rolling cameras from customers' phones, and finally, Big Shaq. Shaq leaned on the counter, looking completely at ease. He was dressed simply, wearing a hoodie and sweats, but the presence he carried was anything but casual. His towering frame and calm, unshaken demeanor made him the most powerful man in the room without even trying. Reynolds exhaled and forced a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. O'Neal," he started, smoothing his tie, "I wish we had known you were here. We would have—" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And if I wasn't—" His voice was deep, steady, and laced with a challenge. Reynolds hesitated. The entire store was watching, cameras recording every second. The last thing he could afford was for this situation to spiral further out of control. He let out a slow sigh, rubbing his temples. "Let's go somewhere private and discuss this." Shaq didn't move. His arms remained folded across his broad chest, his expression unreadable. Jessica, the struggling mother Shaq had helped, clutched her kids closer, watching nervously. Danny, the young cashier, stood stiff behind the register, glancing between his boss and the man who had just changed his life. Shaq finally spoke, his voice casual yet firm. "We could go somewhere private, but why not handle this right here, where everyone can hear it?" Reynolds' Adam's apple bobbed. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, the silent judgment, the recording phones. He knew what Shaq was doing, forcing transparency. The CEO forced a smile, though his fingers twitched at his sides. "Fine," he said through clenched teeth. "Let's talk." The store was dead silent. The tension in the air felt almost electric as all eyes remained locked on Shaq and the CEO, Richard Reynolds. Shaq had made it clear he wasn't going anywhere, not behind closed doors, not into some dimly lit office where corporate could try to sweep this under the rug. Reynolds exhaled sharply, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "Mr. O'Neal, I understand you're upset, but surely we don't need privacy." Shaq interrupted, his voice deep and unshaken. Do this right here, where everyone can hear it. A murmur spread through the crowd. Customers held their phones higher, recording every second. Jessica, still clutching her two kids, wiped a tear from her cheek. Danny, the young cashier, swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the edge of the register. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. His carefully rehearsed corporate tone was useless against Shaq's raw presence. All right, Reynolds sighed. Let's talk. Shaq didn't miss a beat. He lifted a finger. First thing, Danny keeps his job. No write-ups, no warnings, no retaliation. The kid did the right thing today. You fire him, I fire you. Danny's eyes widened in shock. Collins, the store manager, paled, realizing his own position had just become a lot shakier. Second, Shaq continued, raising a second finger, Jessica gets a $50,000 grocery card. No mom should have to put food back while some guy in a suit calls it business. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth. She couldn't even form words. Her children stared up at Shaq as if he were a real-life superhero. Reynolds' jaw tensed. 50,000 is a lot of money, he muttered. Shaq ignored him and lifted a third finger. And last, but not least, this company needs to change the way it treats people. That means better wages, better policies, and better leadership. No more punishing employees for having a heart. The store went eerily quiet. Shaq had just called out an entire corporate structure in the middle of their own store, and they couldn't do a thing about it. Reynolds let out a slow breath. That's, a lot to ask. Shaq folded his arms, his gaze unyielding. Yeah? Then I guess I'll just have to buy this whole company and fix it myself. A tense silence settled over the store, thick enough to choke on. Shaq didn't break eye contact with Reynolds, his towering presence making the polished CEO look smaller by the second. The cameras were still rolling. Social media was already on fire. There was no backing down now. Shaq stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of undeniable power. Or, he said, stretching the moment, I walk out, buy the competition, and make sure your stock crashes by morning. Reynolds stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He had dealt with billionaires before, but none like this. None who had the people on their side. You wouldn't, Reynolds said, though his voice lacked confidence. Shaq chuckled, low and steady. Try me. Jessica clutched her children closer, still trying to process what was happening. Danny, the young cashier, glanced between them, his hands gripping the register counter as if it were the only thing keeping him standing. Reynolds exhaled sharply and looked around. He saw Collins, the store manager, shrinking into the background, knowing he had backed the wrong horse. He saw the customers, their phones pointed at him, waiting for his response. He saw his company's reputation on the line, dangling by a thread. And then, he saw the headlines that would come if he refused. With a slow, reluctant sigh, he straightened his tie. His voice was lower now, filled with forced acceptance. Fine. Done. The words barely left his lips before a roar of applause erupted through the store. Customers cheered, employees exchanged stunned looks. Even Jessica gasped, covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. Shaq just nodded, as if it was never in question. He turned to Danny and Jessica, his voice softer now. That's how you handle business. The celebration was still going when a reporter shoved through the crowd, microphone in hand. Mr. O'Neill, now that you've won, are you buying the company? Shaq smirked, glancing toward Reynolds. That depends. Is he smart enough to keep listening? The energy in the store was still buzzing. Customers whispered in excitement, employees exchanged stunned glances, and even the cameras outside were struggling to capture the full weight of what had just happened. The CEO had surrendered. Jessica had a future. The store's policies would change, but Shaq wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket, his massive hand disappearing for a moment before pulling out a folded check. The store fell into a hushed silence again as he turned toward Danny, the young cashier who had been caught in the middle of it all. Oh, yeah, Shaq said, unfolding the check with deliberate slowness. One last thing. Danny's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Shaq extended the check toward him. This is for you, kid. Danny hesitated before reaching for it. The moment his eyes landed on the amount, his breath hitched. $100,000? His voice cracked in disbelief. He looked up at Shaq, as if waiting for confirmation that this wasn't some kind of joke. Shaq nodded. Use it wisely. Danny's hands trembled slightly as he held the check. I don't even know what to say. His throat tightened, and for a moment he looked overwhelmed, as if his mind was struggling to process that his life had just changed in an instant. Jessica wiped away fresh tears, whispering, "You deserve it, Danny." The store manager, Collins, who had tried to throw Danny under the bus earlier, now stood frozen in place, his face drained of color. He had spent years dismissing Danny's hard work, and now, in front of the entire world, Danny was the one getting rewarded. Shaq placed a firm hand on Danny's shoulder and met his gaze. "Say thank you by helping more people." Danny swallowed hard, then straightened up, his eyes filled with determination. "I will." What he did next, no one saw coming. The moment felt surreal. The entire store was still buzzing with the energy of what had just happened. Policies changed, a struggling mother helped, and a hard-working cashier given a life-changing opportunity. But for Shaq, it was just another day of doing what he knew was right. As he turned to leave, stepping toward the automatic doors, he felt a small tug at his sleeve. Looking down, he saw a wide-eyed young boy, no older than 8, clutching his mother's hand. His tiny face was filled with awe as he stared up at the towering figure before him. "Sir?" the boy asked in a quiet but firm voice. "Are you a superhero?" Shaq paused for a moment, then grinned, lowering himself to one knee so he could look the kid in the eyes. "Nah, lil' man," he said, his deep voice kind but steady. "Just a guy who believes in doing the right thing." The boy beamed, nodding as if he had just been given the most important lesson of his life. Nearby, Jessica wiped tears from her cheeks, overwhelmed with gratitude. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around her kids, holding them close as if she never wanted to let go. The weight she had carried for so long, the struggle, the exhaustion, the fear of not providing for them, had just been lifted, even if only for a moment. Danny, still gripping the check in his hands, took a deep breath and stood a little taller. He looked at Shaq, his expression filled with newfound purpose. "I promise," he said softly. "I'll pay this forward. I won't forget what you did for me today." Shaq gave him a firm nod. "That's what it's all about, kid." As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him, but he barely noticed. The sound of cameras clicking, murmurs from onlookers, and the occasional cheer filled the air, but he paid it no mind. He simply walked toward his car, ready to move on to whatever was next. Just as he opened the door, his phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen. "Another store doing shady business? Say no more." Shaq smirked, sliding into the driver's seat. He cracked his knuckles, then started the engine. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "Time to clean house again."